Hello and welcome to On Second Thought with Mike and Luke, an ongoing conversation about the connections and root causes between ideas and current events. My name is Luke. Across from me sits Mike, and today we're going to talk about insecurity in leadership, Taylor Swift, and the Bible's definition of worldliness, if we can get there. Mike, I have a quick question for you, but before we do that, have you been noticing our numbers, our views on the YouTubes?
Yes, I started watching that, and we were just talking about it. And one of the things we noticed is it's oddly small in the last several episodes. So
yeah, our number of subscribers has gone up. So when we started, it was around 130 or less, and now we're past 150. So you know, percentage-wise, that's nice.
Okay.
But in the last 2 or 3 episodes, it's not hardly in the double digits. Like struggle to get there when we've been over 200 over sometimes.
Yeah,
good episodes.
So we have a high watermark of like 300 for a couple things, 200 something. I would say we're probably between 80 to 100 on average that we had started to hit that. That was kind of a mean number in there.
So how do you explain? I mean, I have my own thoughts
like
about what's
20 and 6.
Yeah,
for the last one.
For the last couple.
Like, that's interesting. Well, okay, so I think what's interesting about it is what we're left to conclude. Mm-hmm. We have an oddity. It seems to be duplicated. So that's one of the things. Can you make a problem happen over and over?
Right.
To say it's not just a coincidence. Well, it seems to be. We have zero knowledge as to why. No data to tell us. But the suspicion that you and I both kind of feel, we know that YouTube and the machinery does not like any of the things we're talking about. Zero.
As far as trans pronouns.
Topics.
Yeah,
and the truth is, even though here's where you and I have come to agreement is that you're a little more clickbaity and I'm a little clickbaity, but I acknowledge that there's a genuine legitimacy in putting a title that makes somebody goes, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. Right?
So we have this compromised position, and so we make titles that have some of these keywords in them.
Well, not only that, I mean, YouTube's algorithm, it's machine learning, certainly knows every word we've said.
Yeah.
And so it's putting us in a category.
That's what we're wondering.
Right? And so I assume they switched our categories a couple episodes back and said, oh, we're not going to put you in front of so many people anymore.
Yeah.
Which
it's
actually,
like
I don't mind. What's funny is those numbers were impressive compared to, maybe the Spotify numbers. But that's where you really grow your...
What does it mean not put you in front of? Do the subscribers to your channel, which this is under, do they literally not see it?
Yeah, correct. Both.
Can they look for it
and
not find it?
More than half of the people who watch our videos are not subscribers, which means it's just being suggested to them.
Yeah.
They're not searching for it.
Yeah.
For the most part.
Yeah.
And then for those, even if you are a subscriber, let's say I subscribe and then I don't watch your videos, it'll actually put you out as if you weren't subscribed, right? It'll pay attention. So those are all things that are part of the fair game of just trying to understand the algorithm.
Yeah.
But there's the categories, I mean, if every big conservative wants to claim their shadow banned, right?
Yeah,
it's sort of a badge of honor.
That's right.
Well, we don't have any evidence for that. But
when you say I think it's a good thing, what did you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is if you're getting 150 views and the average view is 3 minutes, they're not actually listening to our podcast. They just clicked and thought, oh, what's this about? Got a few minutes in and got bored. Mm-hmm. Whereas if they're clicking through Spotify in particular, where you're going to click and you're usually going to go do something else and listen, you're more likely to get actual subscribers, get actual people who are interested in what we're saying, which is that's the only way we're really going to build an audience anyway. So,
yeah.
All right. What do you think? Did you watch the debate last night? The
I did not.
Republicans?
I did not.
I just watched the highlights. I don't bother to watch it, but part of it is I don't have TV, so I'm not going to go to some channel. I saw a pundit, Van Jones, afterward talking about Vivek Ramaswamy's commentary. He was very fiery, more than he's been at all.
Really?
Very pointed.
2 debates ago, it was extraordinary.
Was pointed in his attacks at Nikki Haley and Chris Christie, aggressive.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Van Jones's quote was, I'm literally shaking listening to this, like it's one step away from Nazi talking points, right? And so the question is, when you hear someone say they're literally shaking, how do you respond? Because I just laugh.
Yeah.
Like, because either you are literally shaking, which is laughable,
Yeah.
or it's this melodrama, which is also laughable. I can't decide
That's-
which.
And I know who Van Jones is. So to me, I already have I think it's funny also.
Okay.
It's almost like, here's what the left, and Van Jones, I would say, Van Jones tried to work with Trump.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He has an honest side to him, but he also knows how to play the TV news game.
I totally agree
He
with
is
that.
smart.
Well, yeah, nobody questioned the smartness, I think. I think what you said about the honest side.
There's a lot of not
Okay.
so smart pundits on
That's
cable
true.
news. Yeah.
That's true. Well,
Because you get those,
maybe.
you get those jobs because you're willing to say what they tell you to say.
Okay, so is
to
that
be
a
honest.
lack of smarts?
Well, it doesn't require smarts. So
That's true. It doesn't
intelligence
require.
is not required. You might
Yeah.
get it. I mean,
Yeah.
Van Jones doesn't have his own show. Maybe he doesn't want one.
Yeah.
He's a guest.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Regular,
fair enough.
but-
Smart, but I like the honest comment better. Or
He
when
has
you
been
say it
known
that
to be
way,
honest at times.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that.
Yeah.
There is a modicum of respect for that, even though he parrots a number of things that are ridiculous.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So when he says that, when I hear you say that that's what he said, I just think that is curious. I don't think he really thinks that.
What I think of that phrase, I'm
think he
literally
really-
shaking because I've heard it a lot.
Yeah.
Right? I think of it as a play toward his base, whose political motivation is empathy, is compassion,
Yeah.
right? Trauma responses,
Yeah.
all that.
Yeah.
And so they use these phrases to kick up this like, oh my gosh, yes, I feel it.
Yes. Yes.
Whereas from our side of things,
Yes.
we're trying to
Right.
be,
He's saying
rational
he's
in our
triggered,
way.
is what he's saying. I'm
Correct.
triggered by
Yep.
this.
Yeah.
Now, if Rachel Maddow did it, I would completely say I think it's completely manipulative. She's an incredibly smart person, but I think she is. I don't believe her and trust her at all. But Van Jones has, like you said, this little streak of occasional transparency. He'll call out his own side on something. So
See, and
does
I think that's the smartness in him. I think he's a manipulator too, because everyone, you don't get on those shows unless you're willing to be that.
or your
But he's
Tucker.
also smart enough to occasionally throw a bone to the other side
Yeah.
to give himself credibility.
Yeah.
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 Anyway, all right. Hey, if you want to be part of these conversations, make sure to click subscribe. You will get our next episode sent to you, unless you're on YouTube, because apparently they won't. Also, leave a comment and a review, and throw us a question. We want to know what you want us to talk about, or maybe you want to challenge us on some of the crazy things we like to say.
Why don't we say officially we're going to watch the YouTube? This is an ongoing story, updates to come.
Okay. Yeah,
Because if it keeps like this, then
Because it might just be that we're not that good at YouTube too. All right. So opening segment here. I've got a question around worldliness as it's defined in the Bible and what it actually gets translated to mean by Christians. And it keys off of the conversation we had last couple episodes about how Christians ought to speak about and to their opponents. And should we be gruff? Should we mock? At what times is it appropriate? Is there a percent of the time? Or is it that some people just do that and other people don't? And it kind of stirred up this whole level of thought that I've been having already, which is this sense of, or the phrase gospel-centered, which was kind of a big thing, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago. You heard a lot of Christians saying, we got to be gospel-centered, which I think meant we're not here to die on every hill. Let's focus on the fundamentals. But it also kind of became this, don't apply things too much into the political sphere or into the social, cultural. Like if you just tell them that Jesus died for them and it should be enough. Eventually we'll get to that discipleship stuff in a back room.
I think we should, because this is a side trail when you mention that.
Yeah.
I am probably in significant disagreement with you on that as to what it meant when it was said and why it was said and whatnot. I hear you and I can see Luke hearing it that way, but I don't think that's what was being meant by it. Even though it may have been picked up with some of those tones, but that's not what being gospel-centered, where it came from and what it meant, I think, to...
I didn't hear it in any kind of tone, but I saw it being used in 2020 as a cudgel against active conservatives. So if you were a pastor of a big church, you could say, yeah, we all need to listen to brown voices, right? Or we need, and use the social justice phrasing for liberal political ends. But as soon as somebody stepped out in a conservative direction, no, we got to be gospel-centered. So it became this wedge tool.
Yeah, I never saw it used that way, and I'm not saying it wasn't, but I never saw it used that way. To me, it is trying to grapple with the idea that the gospel is evangelicalism has ended up teaching that the gospel is the way into the building of the church. Let's say the church in society.
Okay.
That is the door in.
Yeah.
And what gospel centeredness is trying to say is that's true, but it is also the door in every single room of the house.
Yeah.
That it is the way to live, not just to be justified or saved, but it is a way to be sanctified or grow in grace. That the gospel is for Christians as much as it is for non-Christians. Just when you're not a Christian and you hear the gospel, to believe in it the first time is going to make a radical transformation in what you are and who you are. That's not the same for a Christian, but the Christian growth is by that same gospel.
Okay, so
And that's what gospel
growing up in
means.
the charismatic wing of the church, I would often hear about maturing in your faith and that you need to move on from milk to solid food.
Yes.
And
yes.
I often interpret that to mean find the deeper meaning behind different passages of the gospel.
Yeah.
Like I remember once reading the story of David retrieving
different texts or verses or stories or whatever.
Yeah, David retrieving the sword of Goliath in this crisis moment
Yeah.
and thinking, oh, there's a symbol to that.
Yes.
It has a deeper meaning.
Yes.
I just don't know what it is yet,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
And someday God will show me.
Yes.
What you're saying is gospel-centered would say, actually, the deeper meaning is still the gospel. You're just
That's
not seeing
right.
it right.
And
Or you're not seeing it to the depth that you could.
or not necessarily seeing it as in seeing it in the text, though that's true, but seeing how what's there delivers you in your today, whatever that is.
Sure.
So, for example, talking about you said David, right?
Yeah.
So David and Goliath. So I grew up not in the charismatic section, but in an evangelical setting. But it's the same message. You get saved by the gospel,
Right.
and then you grow by learning and studying the Bible and praying. And there's all these disciplines.
Which Hebrews
none of
6
those are
says we don't need to lay again the foundation of repentance, of baptism.
None of that is false.
Right.
Those things aren't contributing. But what the gospel ends up coming, gospel-centeredness, I believe, and is that, no, Mike, your Christian growth, while those things are valuable, it is still learning what it means that you are in Jesus. That you are, and I'm going to illustrate with your David here, but the Galatians 2:20, it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. The life I now live. Mm-hmm. So my today.
In the flesh.
I was a Christian 20 years ago, I became a Christian, but the life I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me.
Right.
So how does this shape my today? How does this shape what I looked at today, when I was angry today? How does this shape when I got angry? I told you a story beforehand about a person who criticized me about some things, and I didn't get super mad, but there was a little annoying. But the gospel-centeredness means, Mike, the way you address that is not to put higher duty before yourself, not to memorize more verses, not to quote the anger verses. None of them are wrong.
Right.
But it is to find in Jesus that when you get tripped up, it is the gospel that recovers you and teaches you what to do in this particular moment.
So there's a focus, gospel-centered, that as you heard it,
Yes.
is a focus on the sanctifying process of like
That the gospel,
the fruit of the
also,
Spirit.
Yes, yes.
And that's the depth and found of
That's
maturity.
the pathway to it. Now, there's a couple pathways, but that's the one that's centered on understanding, because walking in the Spirit is also a pathway that your background would have emphasized more. Mm-hmm. And that's also a legitimate pathway for hearing God talk to you. If you get irked about something and you found yourself, you honked at okay, today, I come to a stop sign, somebody else comes, I come to it before her. I didn't know it was her till she drove by. I come to it, stop, they come and roll through it, and they take out of turn, right?
Yeah.
I felt annoyed, and I let myself go. A calm and patient response, who cares? They went out of turn.
Right.
I didn't. I started going forward, and I go like this, like, and this lady goes like this back to me, and all of a sudden,
She didn't see you. That's what that means.
you
Because
know,
she's like, I don't know. But
whatever
anyway,
the reasons,
yeah.
I responded poorly.
You describe it as poorly because you felt a twinge of anger.
That's right. Not the twinge of anger. That's true. That's what it got to, of impatience. But it indicated I was out of step with the Spirit and not living in a peaceableness, that when this occasion happened, no big deal. You can go ahead and go. I'm willing to let you go first.
Right.
I'm not walking in that mindset.
Well,
And so
here's how I see that, and this is a little bit of an aside, but if that had been me, or when that is me, because it happens to me too, of course, right? I think of my anger as a defensive posture of like, oh, I could have been harmed. And my anger has stepped forward to protect me and say, don't let that happen again. Mm-hmm. Not like, hey, it's my turn and you made me feel unimportant, which is why when someone cuts you off, it's not the same as when they cut in line. If you're at the bank and they cut in front of you, that's one thing. That's a like, oh, how dare you? But someone cuts you off on the highway, they could kill you, right? There's a life-threatening aspect to it that makes your anger jump a little more fervently. Cars are a weird thing too.
Yeah.
Okay, but I want to get back to, let me add one more thing. To the charismatic side of things, what I heard, and actually this is a conversation I've been having recently, where we're in a phase of our church where there's a desire among leaders to pursue more spiritual gifts and to see people set free from compulsive behaviors, addictions, right? The effects of trauma long past, those sorts of things, that the spiritual aspect of those bringing healing. And so when I think of the deeper places or the more mature picture that you see described in like Ephesians, right? Growing into the fullness of Christ. I see more ability to engage with those spiritual strongholds, to engage with the deeper and more complex sins that people are revealed to. Because a lot of times as a disciple or a Bible study leader, someone comes to you and says, hey, I'm struggling with this or that. You don't know what to do. And you sort of hope there's a biblical counselor out there and maybe you can give them a number. And so the story that rings for me is Jesus' return from the Mount of Transfiguration. His disciples, his remaining disciples who hadn't gone with him, are stuck. They can't cast out a demon. He deals with it and then says, this kind only comes out through prayer and fasting. That there's another level and you're just not there yet. You're not strong enough. So I always grew up thinking, okay, there's a place where I will trust God with more of me, with more of the inner chambers of my soul, such that I've let him through every door, and he and I trust each other to now do more. Mm-hmm. And I guess what would come from that would be the fruit of the Spirit, but that was never the indicator that would come first in my mind, which is an interesting difference.
Yeah.
Because one of them is very clearly like, we're going to get along, you're going to be at peace, that sort of thing. The other is like doing things, right? Miracles, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I think the difference is people that land or find themselves in gospel-centeredness, or I've used the phrase living in the gospel, what they experience is the fundamental Galatians shift, that you started in the Spirit, and why are you now perfecting yourselves according to the flesh?
Right.
And they realize, oh, I've been doing that. And the way my flesh has been doing it is taking all these Bible responsibilities, biblical responsibilities of praying and fasting and reading Scripture and having devotions and quoting Bible verses and all these things, of which every single one of them are good things.
Yeah.
But using them to sanctify yourself when it's really the gospel, really by the Spirit, that sanctifies you. And so one of the illustrations that is common amongst gospel-centered or gospel-focused people is the David and Goliath story. And so when I grew up, here's how I heard the David and Goliath story, and it's pretty common, I think, is that there's this giant, and represents evil Goliath, and comes David, who's going to become the future king, and then there's storylines in it. But that David then rises up and takes something and trusts in God and goes out and he slays this giant.
Right.
So you can see still movie lines, you can see Bible studies about how to slay the giants. Mm-hmm. So Christians, gospel-centeredness or gospel focus says, no, That's a complete misunderstanding of the story. You're not David, Mr. and Mrs. Christian.
Yeah, this is the famous Matt Chandler line, right?
I don't-
You're not David.
David is Jesus.
Right.
He has slain it before you. You're Israel. It's your fears. It's your insecurities. The story is that Jesus conquers the giants.
So do you think it can't be both? You think you definitely shouldn't be reading yourself into Old Testament stories?
It depends on how you're reading yourself. So gospel-centeredness, it says, find Jesus and then find who you are. The way I grew up is to find yourself the hero and then put yourself in their shoes and try to do what they did.
Which is the what would Jesus do idea.
That is the what would Jesus
right?
do. And
That
so what it does...
Even you see what Jesus did and you say, I'm going to try to do that too.
Yeah. So I think what it does, and here's the thing, doing what is right and obeying is not a wrong thing, but it is if that's how you become sanctified, or that's how you become more holy, and then what ends up happening is it works its way, and we're way off topic here from where you were wanting to go, but it works its way into your fundamental approach to life. So what happens, and this is what happened to me, there came a time and something happened in life, I didn't respond well to it, and I was deeply shaken by this occasion, this event, this time frame. And all that I had been striving to build as a Christian seemed to come into question and whatnot. And it was very discouraging. And I rediscovered the gospel because in my brokenness, I had nothing, in a sense.
Yeah.
And I learned that, I had become a Christian and then thought I had something.
So this reminds me...
I was diligent in this area or that area.
Yeah.
And those were all good things.
Right.
But they had begun to accrue and become righteousness to me.
That you were earning something.
That I was, as I pursued sanctification, I didn't even know that it had happened.
Okay, so I think this is very connected to where I want to go with this. But before we do that, there's a theological concept that I think connects.
Oh, I forgot to turn this thing.
And that is the difference between, and you're going to have to help me with terms, immanence, that God is immanent and he is transcendent. So the emphasis reading any of the Bible stories saying, don't focus on yourself in that story, see God's work, see Jesus personified, right? Is like reminding yourself of the transcendence, how high above us he is. And the other side is saying he's also among us. He's one of us. I can't say among us.
Yeah.
My boys, they all trigger when anybody says among us.
Why?
It's like an echo. There's a video game.
Oh, okay.
And so every kid under 20
a certain age,
just starts going among us. Anyway.
Okay,
So
all
I
right.
apologize to whoever's listening for that. But that he's one of us. He's like us in important ways. And so I think you have to have both. When you read David, you have to see, wow, this shows me how grand Jesus is, right? And that he entrusted himself to the Father to gain the victory, which is how Jesus gained the victory. He completely entrusted himself, right? And went to the lowest place. But then it also instructs me, say, maybe God could do that for me. Maybe I could gain a high position of significance in life, like David did, like Solomon did. But I also have to watch for how they fell, right? So I think it's really valuable. Okay, so I want to bring that back to this concept of worldliness because I think it also informs how church leaders are interacting with the culture. So when you focus on that transcendence and our lowly position, I think we then address the culture from a almost submissive posture. Kind of, I think what you were saying last episode about, it's about losing so that we win, which isn't exact, how do we kind of worked on what does it mean to lose and in what spheres, right? Versus the more aggressive posture, the prophet Elijah, John the Baptist, Jesus at times, right? Saying, I'm going to turn the other cheek if you attack me physically, but the war is a war of ideas. It's a war, it's a spiritual war, meaning what you believe in your spirit, in your heart. And so I'm going to wage war about beliefs, knowing that when they attack me in the physical, that's when I am saying I completely entrust myself to God. I don't fight that fight. And I don't think it's actually the physical as much as it is the personal. I don't defend myself. I defend the gospel. Do you know what I'm saying?
I do.
So that brings me to these dueling definitions of worldliness that I saw interacting.
Okay.
And again, still with the Doug Wilson and the Kevin DeYoung.
Kevin DeYoung.
Okay, back and forth between the two of them.
Yeah.
And that was Kevin DeYoung was saying that the crassness, the abrasive, the targeting of our ideological enemies, that was a worldly meaning, like not portraying the fruit of the Spirit, not being a peacemaker,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's worldly in that way.
Yeah.
And he's defining worldliness as acting in an uncouth or uncivilized manner, maybe sinful even in your ambitions to stir up strife and all those things. Okay.
Yeah.
When I read the definition of worldliness, and I haven't done a thorough study on it, it would be interesting. I read it as trying to make friends with the world, trying to be winsome, like we've talked about. And so to me, that's a very different version, because if you took those two definitions, each of those two sides, Doug Wilson and the Moscow, Idaho crew, Kevin DeYoung and some of the big and mid-sized church perspective, right? The kind of upper middle class suburban churches, they can both point the finger and say, you're being worldly. On the one side, you're being worldly because you're not acting kind and gentle and lowly. On the other side, you're being worldly because you're trying to impress the non-Christian friends and make them think you're respectable and not like those other Christians who judge everyone. Which one's the biblical model? That's, I think, the question. Because I would describe Doug Wilson and the post-millennial guys as, I would guess when they read Daniel in the Lion's Den, they take it as instructional, that this is what we're going to do too, right? The post-millennials, they're ambitious to conquer every nation, its government, and bring it under the heel of Christ. Versus the idea of like John MacArthur, who says we lose down here, like this isn't going to go well for us no matter what we do. So politically, we're going to take our stand and then assume that we are defeated.
Well, so I don't, Kevin DeYoung, I've read a couple things that he's done, but I'm not as familiar with him. Would you say he is a be nice, and it has become an idolatrous kind of excessive be nice?
No. I mean, I'm not extensive. Haven't read his content.
Yeah.
I've followed him loosely over the last couple of years, and I respect what he has to say.
Yeah.
I don't see him as someone who compromised on COVID or who became authoritarian or who said everybody has to put up the black square. He wasn't. He wasn't all the way down that road.
Right.
Right. So, which is why it matters what he has to say. Because if he was, I just wouldn't care what he said.
Yeah.
But I do think he has that other definition of worldliness, and I think that is the debate, and they're not having it. Which is, what does it really mean to be worldly?
Yeah.
Because we know if friendship with the world is enmity toward God, that's
Right.
very clear.
Yeah.
But is it friendship with the world to try to be winsome, or is it simply being a peacemaker?
Yeah.
Do you see what I mean?
I do. My response to that is not going to be helpful. Because I want to say, I think there's aspects, I think I see something that both are trying to say as a complaint.
Yep.
And therefore, that sounds like I'm taking a middle of the stance road. And I don't think that I am. I don't think my stance is middle of the road, but I can understand how those two illustrations, they're both seeing something. So we talked last time.
It's not unhelpful to say, when you're presented with an either or, it's okay to say, actually, it's both and.
Yeah.
Which is what I hear you about to do.
Yeah, maybe. So the critique from DeYoung towards Agenda Credenda guy.
That's an old reference.
I know.
I've never heard it. Doug Wilson.
That was their periodical. That's before they were what they are today.
Okay.
But the critique, let's just say, against of Mr. Nice against Mr. Brassy. Okay.
Okay.
And that's the complaint, right?
Yeah.
You're speaking. Now, here's where I fall in line with that, where I agree. You have Elijah do what he did.
Right.
You can find a couple Paul examples of that. Mm-hmm. You can find a couple times Jesus, though the tone might be a little different, some of the words, anytime you call anybody a whitewashed tomb, that's in this camp, right?
Yeah.
I think there's a difference,
Go
though,
tell that
between
fox.
If the concern that says, you did this, and I think that should never be done, I wouldn't agree with that. But I hear the complaint as, this is the way you're trying to function as a regular practice. So it's interesting what's happening right now is I didn't know this was where all today was going to go, but you and I are thinking about the things that the other person is saying.
Yeah.
Which is good. Mm-hmm. We're thinking and trying to hear what the other person is saying and think what I think. Does that change it, adjust it? Anyway, we're doing that because I've been doing the same thing. So I listened to Steve Deace, 2 full episodes. Because the last time we were together, you talked, or maybe it was 2 times ago, you really like him. And I thought, well, I had tried him once before shortly, and I did. But listen. Well, here's what I left with. I don't enjoy this.
Yeah, it's stressful.
Caustic. Mm-hmm. It is as if he took, and he actually quotes the Elijah. Here's what I did. I like several things that he said.
Yeah,
I like several content things. I thought he was on. There was some content things I disagreed with, that's no big deal.
Yeah.
But the approach was like, I'm going to be this Elijah, and he quotes the Elijah model of mockery. Right. You and I have said it a couple times. And I felt like what he was saying was, this is okay to do regularly.
Right.
And that's where I disagree. I don't think it is. But I don't deny that it is, on occasion, it's the appropriate thing. But if this is the problem I had with Doug Wilson when I was a young man, every agenda credenda, that was the spirit constantly.
Correct, yeah.
And I had to, and that's what Piper was complaining about as well. And that was after I had stopped reading. I thought, I was glad to hear somebody else say the same thing because I couldn't do it. It was too much for me. I already struggled with trend towards being a critical person. I didn't need somebody doing it regularly and saying this is biblical.
So here's where I'll tell my story to this because I'd never heard of Doug Wilson before 2020.
Yeah.
I mean, I probably heard him somewhere, but I didn't know who he was.
Yeah.
What I found though is if your house is on fire, someone needs to be yelling. They need to be cracking windows.
Yep.
They need to be getting people out, right?
Yep.
If a child's being actively harmed, you take violent action.
Yeah.
And so what I see is we've entered an era, or at least a phase in our culture, where to me it feels that urgent.
I hear you.
And in that
I know
case,
that's where you're coming from.
My like impulse, because my impulse was also to be like, let's be respectable, right?
Yep.
Let's be relevant to the culture. Let's keep tabs on the music scene. Let's understand what's going on, what they're talking about. And let's offend them with the things worth offending, but let's not offend them with everything. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so I'm not there anymore.
I hear what you're saying, and I respect why you're saying that.
Yeah.
But it doesn't connect. I still feel like it's not sufficient to change the whole way of interaction.
But how far does it, because Elijah, I would say the bulk of his ministry was dealing with Ahab and Jezebel. Mm-hmm. So he's going to take that role as it's needed. If he had lived 50 years before or after, maybe his ministry would be totally different, regardless of his personality.
Yeah.
So he was the man of the era. He did what was needed in that moment.
So I want to give the ground, so to speak. It's hard not to talk, it's interesting. Warfare is an interesting analogy and metaphor.
Yeah.
Because metaphors define our life. They actually are more important than blank statements or direct statements because they help us to flesh out things. So the reality is, even our conversation, metaphor defines it because here's what I'm going to say. I want to give the ground. Mm-hmm. I don't want to try to hold territory. I think it's legitimate to, on occasion, when needed, that you speak this way.
Right.
I'm not trying to grab that. But the reason I don't think it's the way we should, and we shouldn't live that way, even if your argument is, and your argument I also give ground to, in this instance, if you and I are sitting across the street at the cafe, mm-hmm. and somebody starts beating on a girl, we hopefully get up and intervene and put ourselves at risk. We raise our voice, our actions. We get engaged in a way that's not normal to our mode of living.
Correct, yeah.
And it's appropriate. The problem is when you take that, I think the problem is, when you take that and justify it for our times are so, this kind of thing is happening culture-wide, mm-hmm. therefore we have to respond as if we're in the cafe seeing that. I personally think that's a mistake. I think it is letting the rightness of an occasion determine the continual phase of a ministry and justifying by saying, this is happening all over the place out there.
Well, what's interesting, and it does remind me of John Piper. I was thinking about the wartime mentality. We've talked about this, the Queen Mary. I told you that story of how every room in the ship after World War II, they restored half the room to its pre-war state as an opulent place for royalty.
Yeah.
But they maintained, literally down the middle of each room, they maintained it as a troop carrier to demonstrate the difference between a wartime mentality and that.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of what you're describing is, have we geared ourselves to a war, to a hostile environment, to imminent danger? Can you live like that?
Okay, that's a good analogy. I'll say, yes, I agree with what you said, but I want to modify it. And it's this. A war, that I think that works, but getting to where I would object is to modify the ship for wartime. That ship modification, there's nothing bad in it. It's just not useful to have a troop carrier when there's no war.
Right.
And the royals and the rich people, they're the ones who buy and travel on these ships. It's reasonable that
they wouldn't have made this
for
ship
them
if it wasn't. Right.
So I'm not really saying it in that way. I'm saying it in this. When he says, Elijah says those things, when Paul does what he does, when Jesus does what he does, that it's fitting and appropriate for that occasion because it's risen up in the face of somebody. But to take that occasion and build your life around it when you don't have those things rising up, but you see them out there, they're rising up in front of other people, I think then those attitudes, I agree with Kevin DeYoung then. They become not... So I have in my notes here...
It bleeds into your family relationships and into your neighborly...
The Spirit bleeds into it.
Right.
So in 2 Corinthians 10, it's in my thing for later on, but we'll pull it out here. It's the passage about tearing down strongholds. It's the most war aggressive passage, more than Ephesians 6 is, because Ephesians 6 is so dominated by defense. And we talked extensively about that before. But what's so interesting about it is it starts out with these people, he's writing a letter to this group, and those group have accused him of being fleshly or worldly. But it's actually fleshly. It's a little similar, but not the same as worldly, right?
Okay.
The world, the flesh, and the devil, if you have those three.
Yeah.
They're connected, but they're not the same. They've accused him of being sarx, fleshly, and he thinks they're misunderstanding him. And he's trying to talk to these people. And so here's what he says. I beseech you, I appeal to you by the meekness and the gentleness of Christ. Then, so he appeals to the Kevin DeYoung things that he's advocating for, right?
Right.
But then he says to him to be bold and to have, it doesn't use courage, it's really the word bold. The boldness that these guys were accusing him. They're basically saying when Paul writes you letters, Paul's inconsistent.
Because when he shows up, he doesn't...
He shows up,
he's quiet,
and so...
soft-spoken.
Yeah. So we think that's of the flesh, that Paul isn't. Whether they wanted him to be soft all the time or loud all the time, I don't know.
Part of that was a Greek culture where public discourse was highly esteemed. If your ability to publicly debate gave you stature.
Sure, okay.
And early on, the apostles gained a lot of favor because they were full of the Holy Spirit, able to engage with these highly educated and sophisticated philosophers, religious leaders. Said, these guys are untrained. How are they doing this? They had the Holy Spirit of God.
Yeah.
So if Paul is coming and he's this long, all night long lecturer, right? He's deep into the learning. Someone says you're losing your mind from all your learning. He's not portraying himself in this status culture of super apostles.
That's true.
Right? And so
That's
he's
true.
trying to say, look, I'm meek for a reason.
He had said in the first letter, when I was among you, I desired to know nothing except Jesus Christ and Him crucified. I didn't come with persuasive words.
That's right.
Which seems to go against the 2 Corinthians 10 in tearing down strongholds of arguments. It's your words and you're combating the ideas that hold belief systems.
Right.
But he says, look, I didn't try to do these. I didn't come with displays of power to try to impress you.
Yeah.
And so I think their offense is that when he writes these strong things, they get offended at that because when they met him in purpose, he was very meek and mild face to face.
And I think there was a strategy on his part, being led by the Holy Spirit, that this culture was bombastic. It was wealthy. So he shows up and he refuses to be bombastic. He refuses to take their money.
That's
And so
true.
he's saying, I came here to oppose your culture.
Okay.
Right? I'm going to
agree.
portray a Christ like you're saying, of humility. And I don't know if this is in the 2 Corinthians thing. I was actually looking for this earlier today to bring it. Because I think it might be Galatians where he's saying, I'm not as holy as some of these people who apparently turn the other cheek
That's
when false
in 2
teachers arrive.
Corinthians. Yeah.
It's the same sort of thing. He's saying, look, maybe I'm not turning the other cheek. Why would I? I don't let, like a shepherd protects the sheep.
Yeah.
I'm not going to just back down.
Yeah. And in that passage, he ends up defending his apostleship, and he even says the funny thing, I'm out of my mind by even doing this.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting, though, is in that I think the earlier than 10 is where he said, these guys compare themselves to one another about who's the greatest, who's great.
Right.
They have lost their minds in doing this. They are outside of they're outside. Really, the gospel-centered people would say they're outside. They're not living in the gospel when they're doing that.
Okay.
That's what they
because
think.
Because they're entering this self-promotion.
That's right.
Self-defense.
And the gospel is not about it. Is give your life up, lay it down, pick up a cross, this Roman war, torture, dominion thing, and carry that as your symbol of you can destroy me, but you won't win.
So here's the way. Because I don't see those as a dichotomy.
Which ones?
Between saying the gospel is carrying your cross, and I'm going to aggressively attack false teaching and infiltration of sinful behaviors into the church, right? Because what I see is it
So when
sort
you
of
say
feels
aggressively,
like
do you mean the mockery of Elijah? Is that what you mean when you say aggressively?
Yeah.
See, because
even in 2 Corinthians, I see Paul mocking these, calling them super apostles and all this stuff. I see a tone there where he's saying, I'm out of my mind, but let's go down this road. These guys are crazy.
I'm in agreement but you're not necessarily saying this way, when it's on an occasion. My disagreement is that when that becomes a lifelong approach, because you justify that the whole culture should be treated this way,
right?
That you are then no longer carrying the meekness and gentleness of Jesus. You're no longer submitting to a cross. You're no longer humble in your presence.
Right.
But I'm bold in your presence because I'm going to tear down the stronghold of your argument.
Well, this is something I wanted to talk about later, which is the overlap between confidence and humility. But before we get to that, my thinking is simply that we have to, like, if ever there was a time that we're in popular culture, like Tucker Carlson is saying, the political system has already been dismantled. It doesn't exist anymore, right? Popular podcasters are saying civil war is on the verge. Like, the house is on fire. So Doug Wilson maybe has been doing this for too long, but I would say for most of it, he wasn't getting that much attention, except by those people who are already inclined to be too aggressive. But now suddenly he's getting a lot of attention because now this time is right to take up these spiritual arms and really get in the fight. So I think, there is a time for rest. There is a time for recuperation, for even, Solomon's grandeur and opulence. But there's also a time for war. There's a time for David to conquer all of the what is it? The giants in the mountains,
Okay. Can I offer a disagreement, but from a different tack?
Okay.
Just because we're talking about it?
All right, but we're deep into this one, time-wise.
What if that should never be, what you just said should never be the case, and maybe this is the problem. It's the time because we agree that especially the transgender mutilation. Well, we would say this, starting with, I just saw, it wasn't even Babylon Bee, it was in a news article. Women producers in Hollywood just put out a statement. They're not going to make any of their movies in the states that don't have pro-choice, So here was the
Hollywood's
headline.
not really in a position to make demands.
Here was the headline.
Yeah.
Women producers determined only to produce movies where they can kill their babies.
Right. Or where men can take their roles.
So, starting with that atrocity, which is 1972,
Yeah.
but finding its capstone, many things that have participation in elements of evil. But in terms of atrocity, there's been nothing more significant than that decision to murder babies. And where we end up now, the castration and destruction of children, as Tucker says, not apparently for money and power, but the sheer delight in it.
Right.
That is the changing of a time, right?
I don't
Over a
even
50-year period.
think that's the majority of it. If you look at the sheer number of people harmed by the COVID vaccine, by the lockdowns and the mandates, the way the cultural upheaval of the riots and
But
racial division.
here's the difference in that.
What I'm saying is it's a total
I agree with
onslaught
you.
of spiritual war.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it does show up in sexual deviance. It does show up in promiscuity that results in abortion.
Yeah.
But it also shows up in every fiber and function, every institution of our culture is being either dismantled or completely possessed by the spirit of the age. And so there is nowhere to retreat. So you have to engage or die spiritually.
Okay, so let's go there. You say that in a way, and I can guess which one you think is right or appropriate, right?
As far as,
Engage or die.
so what I'm trying to say,
Fight or die.
what I'm saying is, I don't engage in, like, I don't publicly mock people
Yeah.
much. I'll make jokes, right?
yeah.
But I'm not going to target somebody in a conversation and mock
Yeah.
them to their face.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't want to make it, because I don't think it's good argumentation. Like an ad hominem,
No, I agree.
attack is not effective. But I do think it needs to be in the tool belt.
Well, yes.
And what I see is you've got a belt of weapons, right?
I agree with this.
Spiritual
So,
armor.
yeah.
And I see people like Kevin DeYoung coming over saying, wait, not this one. That one will make things dirty. And not that one. That
I
one's-
don't know enough.
doesn't.
Is he objecting to it that Elijah, it was wrong for Elijah to do that? Paul, there seems to be one or two occasions. Or is he objecting to it as the tool that is the main tool now?
So the claim
because
was,
it's so bad that
here's
we
his-
need to use this tool all the time.
Here was his ask for Doug Wilson, because November is no quarter November. That's the Doug Wilson's blog, and he focuses his writing for that month on culture war issues.
Okay.
Saying, I'm not going to give any explanations. I'm not going to condition any statements. We're just going to go in November. So what to Kevin DeYoung's loaded request, verging on a command or a morally loaded.
He disagrees. And so
No,
he's-
what he was saying is you should do a month where it's all about peacemaking. It's all about focus on Jesus saves. In fact, why not do a whole year? Which is basically using that gospel-centered argument, and this is where it comes back, to say disengage from the issues where the war actually is being fought. And instead retreat back and just say, let's hug each
But
other.
see, I think I disagree with that. I don't think it is disengaging. If it is disengaging, then you have to say Jesus disengaged when he allowed himself to go to the cross and be killed by Rome and the religious system in his situation.
So
Pilate.
if you look at every
Herod.
epistle, maybe not every, but every one I'm thinking of, it starts in a foundation of theology and it ends in a practical wisdom and
Right.
application.
Yep.
And so I think if you say, well, just focus on the theology, which is the cross, focus on the gospel, focus on who you are in Christ, and never get down to how husbands should treat wives, right? How slaves should deal with masters, how children should look at their parents. If you never apply it to society and its brokenness, what's it for?
Okay,
You're
so
missing the
here's
whole
what I
second half.
think gospel-centered approach thinks is that what they hear what you're saying as flipping them,
Yeah.
that you're calling for action without establishing gospel first.
Okay.
And that's going to lead to a bad place. It's going to feel very good at the beginning because you're feeling like you're doing something.
But again, it's an either or, right? Because I would immediately think, my thought immediately is, you're just refusing to call for action, and all you talk about is the gospel. But it's
I
not
don't-
an either or. It needs to be
Yeah.
a both and.
Well, I agree, the second part, but it has to flow from one to the other. It can't flow the other direction.
Yeah, I agree with you there. Because
So-
otherwise, you just are heaping heavy burdens on people's shoulders, and you refuse to help them lift it.
Well,
You become a Pharisee.
that's
when you focus
yes,
on action
it
only.
leads to Phariseeism because what you do is more important than what you believe. And it should go the other way. What you believe is foundational to what you do. I'm not in at all disagreement with that there are implications of what the gospel is for our individual lives. But I'm in disagreement as to how we engage with those issues, that we trick ourselves into our engagement with them becomes the gospel to us. That's what really makes us holy or
Yeah.
not worldly. And then what we end up communicating, and so I'll get to something which you disagree with, but I agreed with Tim Keller on this. And when I was pastoring, not having anti-abortion material out on the table, so to speak, because it's an issue that flows out of the gospel. This is my opinion,
Yeah.
and I want to address it after having said what the gospel is first. Then I want to say what I think this means. And if you put it out on the table, it becomes the front door into the church. The issue and the response becomes a front door. And I think it does something to me over the long run. And it communicates to Mrs. Smith, who has heard about this and has something trouble, and she's come to church for the first time, or he, Mr. Smith or whatever. And he sees that and says, oh, that's what this is about.
Right.
Well, it is eventually, but not to start off with.
So do you put it on the back wall of the sanctuary so they only see it when they're walking out? Here's what I worry.
Yes.
Here's what I worry, because I sort of agree and I sort of don't. Because I remember listening to, like, when you listen to Joel Osteen go on a cable news interview, or you listen to Carl Lentz, was the Hillsong pastor in New York City who eventually fell from grace. But both of those guys, when asked these hard questions, I remember Carl Lentz on The View, and what do you say to someone about abortion?
Yep.
And he says, well, that's something we could talk about later. Mm-hmm. And it's like, yeah, but if it's always later, and then eventually you just never talk about it. And it comes back to that sort of winsome conversation.
Did you see Osteen on with Oprah about that when she asked about that?
No.
He was exceptional. He defended the biblical position.
Okay.
But he also then, after he said that, he goes, I have to believe what Scripture says.
I'll give him that.
Yeah.
Is that he's been pressed in a lot of ways. Yeah. He'll misuse the Bible, man, in his sermons. It's pretty ugly sometimes. But I've never heard him actually deny what the Bible teaches.
No. Yeah.
He just doesn't want to talk about it because it hurts people's feelings.
In a sense, yeah, I know. There's place to criticize him.
All right, that was a big can of worms. I feel like
you didn't even do half the things that you wanted to do on here.
Well, we get to some of them. Yeah, so the thing we could get to later is how do we, that application is what I'm talking about with
How about
wisdom.
this? Do the next thing with the people stuff and culture, but then end with the stuff that you didn't do here. I'm still game to keep talking about it.
See. Okay. We might have to do part 2 because we're 50 minutes in here. So
okay.
All right. Hey, this is the Trinity School, or part of it at least. We're a culture building enterprise that includes education, but also influence and industry and the arts. We're trying to learn how to influence and build a culture that glorifies Christ. If you want to learn more, or you could donate to our efforts to help kids pay their tuition, go to gracestaten.com/Trinity School. All right, Times Person of the Year was Elon Musk. No, wait. Taylor Swift.
If it had been, we would have been intrigued, as would the rest of society, and also they'd have been mad.
Imagine if they had printed that out, and then all of this last week kerfuffle had come undone. And they would have lost that. Although I think Hitler was in his era Times Person of the Year at one point.
Okay, what do you think about that?
It's the Person of the Year is not meant to be a place of honor.
I think.
It's meant to be a position of impact.
Significance.
That's right.
I totally.
Which I think Taylor Swift, the priestess of pop culture, leading her thrones away from the gospel.
I agree with you on that. I also think they have an agenda for putting her there, and I think it's this: help us out, Taylor. Come on. Advocate for Biden. Advocate for the left.
Which she did.
Speak up.
She started to do in the last few years.
She started to do more and more. And I think they're basically saying, see, we'll reward you. Keep it up, girl. Right. Because she's influential. Extraordinarily influential.
It also, she's on this big tour.
Yep.
She's made a lot of money. A lot of people are going to see her.
Yep.
They did a thing where the movie theaters were simulcasting one of her shows.
Yeah.
It sold out all over the place.
I know.
Which is, movie theaters are struggling, to be honest, right? The brick and mortar movies.
They're on their way down.
But so I think a lot of this is just probably the company that owns Time is also the company that owns whatever her record album is. I think
it could be
marketing manipulation is always assumed.
So that's funny that you and I both, in a sense, have the same reservation about it, right?
Let's look it up.
There's something appropriate in it, and there's something suspiciously hidden.
Yeah.
I also think, before we talk about Elon Musk, and there's Taylor Swift, here's something I've been thinking about recently. 2 things. Number one, has some friends They went up to Seattle to her concert. These are 20-somethings, and she cried. She cried during the. And here's what she said.
Not Taylor.
No. This our
Yeah,
friend.
your friend in the audience.
Yeah. Who is I like this person. Anyway, her and her husband I like. But she cried, and here's what she said. This was my entire childhood. These songs.
Yeah.
My entire childhood. Everything is wrapped up. When I was going through something, it's those songs, right? And I think that's interesting, and I haven't even exactly figured out what it is, because you and I both enjoy music, and we might enjoy different music, but it's important to us both, right? I would never say that. I had music that was very a part of my childhood, and I enjoy listening to some of it. Some of it I can't listen to anymore, but it doesn't make me cry. It wasn't so integral to my personhood that I would weep in hearing it. And I don't think it's just a male boy thing.
I remember listening to, I have my own thoughts about Taylor Swift. To me, it has very little meaning. I agree. There was definitely some.
Well, I like her music. I like a lot of her songs. I think they're incredibly
But
catchy.
one of the things I've heard, and I don't know if I can ascribe this to Taylor Swift or not, but I wouldn't doubt if it was, is a lot of the music industry is pursuing spiritual power.
Okay.
In the
This is what
way
I
they
agree.
make music.
I
As we
agree
talk,
with
though,
you.
I'm trying to look up. So Taylor Swift's record company is Republic Records, and then it's owned by the Universal Music Group. And I'm trying to follow it down. Does it get to Time Warner? But I can't do it all.
So here's my suspicion that I've begun to develop. About 3 months ago, I began to have this vague idea of something.
Yeah.
And it's and the best words I can come up with at the moment is it's not really on second thought yet. It's on 1.5
First
thought.
Okay.
And it's that there's something spiritual taking place that she has agreed to, whether verbally or not verbally, I don't know. But she is taking a role, in my opinion, that is idolatrous. She is allowing and taking to herself something. She has exceeded Beyonce. She has exceeded, she's in Michael Jackson territory, but with the unique spin of today's less grounded, spiritually more vulnerable setting. And she's taking it willingly. And I believe she is becoming, let me air quote this, a goddess.
Oof. That's a loaded thing.
I want to air quote it, which gives me the liberty to say, no, I don't mean
There
this
is
or
worship
that.
there, though.
There is worship going on.
Oh, my gosh.
And I think she knows a little bit of it and is asking for it and taking it. Whether she could articulate it, because she grows up in a Christianized environment,
Yeah.
right?
Well, I think my understanding is the majority of musicians I don't know if in the highest levels of pop culture, but in just the music scenes, they learned how to play music at church.
Yeah.
And then they turned away.
Yeah.
But I was looking up pictures of her concerts because I saw a video clip of her, and she was standing on this huge black box, probably 20 feet cube.
Yeah.
And it's a sea of fans all around, and she's on top of it singing and dancing. But the image immediately conjured to me was of Mecca and all of the Muslims making their pilgrimage to this big black box to worship and walk circles around it. And then I was looking for that image, and I found one instead of her and giant snake cobras coming up out of the stage 50 feet tall, and her singing underneath them. I was like, it's the symbolism.
It is extraordinary.
It's a full-on spiritual production of what they're doing.
Do you remember the last productions, the concerts that Michael Jackson gave, and did you see any of the images?
No.
When he rose up out of the floor, and I believe he stands with his back turned to the audience in a pose.
Right.
And the
His
lights.
iconics.
He assumes an iconic posture and holds it. It had to have been 60 seconds as the crowd is going crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's what I see in Taylor too. Remember even the commercial she does. Well, she's pretty as a person, but that's not what it is. It's when she creates pictures that capture their iconic images that capture more than, it's not just her there.
Right.
It captures femininity. It captures, it's not even lust, desire maybe.
I think that for young
It's
women,
incredible what she captures in
there's
her
an accessibility that they see her as personifying what I wish I was,
I completely agree.
which is
That's what it
which
is.
is the aspirational symbolism, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And what
and
I
it's
wish
really
I was
powerful,
as female, as woman.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's 90% of her audience, I'm sure.
Yeah. I don't know. I just get warning bells. I think we're in the middle of watching something that is incredibly sad and distorted, and it's going to end badly.
So what you see is a trajectory where she's embracing the power, the
That's
spiritual
right.
power,
And my heart
in a way
began to
that's
hurt
becoming
for her
manipulative.
in the last year.
Yeah.
I began to feel pain for her because this looks like for her as complete victory, and it's going to be an utter fall. Whether it is pride goes before a fall, and not pride. It's not male pride. It's not the male pride, but it's almost a female version of it. It's going to be a painful drop whenever.
It's quite a prediction.
Yeah, and I don't know that something tragic has to happen, but I think you could say Michael Jackson comes to a pinnacle.
It's the selling of one's soul for fame and accolade.
That's what it is. That's
is
why I
really
said
common.
an
And
agreement.
I don't know that she's done that,
verbal
but
or not.
it feels like it's
It
happening.
feels like a selling of a soul for something, and the rewards right now are massive, but
So,
they won't stay.
One of the things that in my thinking
Gaining
about the
whole
Trinity,
world.
right? In my thinking about the Trinity, and what are the parts of us and the parts of culture, because I think culture is a Trinitarian being as well, like every society. And in the spiritual realm is both creativity and connection, trust. Mm-hmm. So in your heart, you believe, you trust that God is good, but you also believe other things. And that's where the war is, right? You fight to believe. And so with that trust, with that relationship, creativity is born. I think you see it in marriage, that when you have a loving husband and wife, creativity, literally, humans
Is
are
a
created,
product of it,
right?
Yeah.
So I think you can then look around and say, oh, this machine of the arts, pop culture, it's not art really. It's a machine they've built to manufacture trust. That you're going to see somewhere. You look at pop culture world and you're going to somewhere see yourself, or you're going to see who you wish you were, or who you're mad at, right? Or whatever it is. And then you can buy into it and say, oh, these people speak for me, and I'll give them my money, and
I think that's right. I think that's a good way to say it.
I think that there's a manipulative witchcraft to it.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. There's definitely actual occult witchcraft. But I think witchcraft can embody manipulative, power-hungry inauthenticity.
Yeah.
I'm not actually going to say what I know is true. I'm going to say what you want to hear in a way that's going to draw your trust in, so that I can get what I want out of you.
Yeah.
I can get your worship. I can get your money.
Yeah.
And that's why I think greed is the sin of the spirit. When your spirit sins, it turns to greed. And greed is it's a lust of the eyes. It's beauty. It's more for me. But if there's a relational aspect to greed, a comparison of I want more than you have. I want to be the best. And greed and pride go really well together, obviously.
Yeah. That fits, that resonates with me when you say it that way. And because we've talked before a little bit about actors.
Yeah.
And what happens when some of them play a role and they get that and they become that role and they live that role.
Yeah.
Because that got them worship. And to me, that's always struck me and there's other actors who don't. They take a role. They're capable, for whatever reasons, of setting that aside, and then they are themselves. And then they take another role. But those ones that I always have felt like they must be trapped. They must, I bet they feel lonely.
Yeah.
Because they're not loved for who they are.
Because no one knows who they are.
No one knows.
If you knew who I really was.
If they yes, and that can cause despair.
And that's the imposter syndrome that you hear about all over the place.
I completely agree. I think Owen Wilson, for example, is a guy like that. These ones, I think Jim Carrey has faced that. I think these people who are almost manic depressive in a sense. That's too far to say, but they live out these high, and then you hear that in private, they're suicidal.
Sure, yeah.
And I think it's because that's not them.
Well, and also the acclaim, especially in front of a tangible crowd of thousands or of fans, it is like a drug. I've heard musicians talk
Yes.
about it. I've heard
Yes.
actors talk about it.
Yep.
I've heard comedians talk about it.
Yeah, the laughing.
Even
getting the laugh.
athletes say,
Yeah.
all I want is that cheer, and I'll do
Adoration,
whatever
yeah.
it takes to get it.
So off topic, but connected, because do you feel like as we're talking about this, that there's some insight and accuracy, but it garners some, as Christians, some sympathy, accusation of wrong, but there's a sorrow in it. These people are going to suffer. It's their choices. There's wrong. It can be criticized,
Yeah,
but it's also lost to them.
part of what I see is as I've grown, when I was a younger man, I thought actors were the most influential and important people in Hollywood. They're not at all, right? And the same as goes with musicians. Even Taylor Swift has to fight in court over the course of years to gain control of the songs she wrote.
Right.
Right? There's a huge machine of manipulation. I remember listening to a testimony of there was a girl band in the early 2000s.
The Spice Girls?
It doesn't matter. Anyway,
Yeah.
one of these girls was no longer famous, was in an interview where she said, I was just a prostitute. She literally said the producers had a tryout for who got to be in this girl band. I was pretty enough to do it. I could barely sing. They didn't matter.
Yeah.
And then I was told
That's
who I
right.
had to sleep with, and it was a string of these old rich men who were going to fund the next album or fund the tour and their investments. And it was like, and I just couldn't do it anymore, and I had to get out.
Yeah, interesting.
Which to me makes sense why Hollywood in particular would be a place where there's such a fierce protection for abortion. Because there's all these women who are being demanded of them that they become something that this is not what I came here for.
Yeah.
And yet it seems to be required to
Yeah.
go upstairs with Harvey Weinstein or whomever.
Right. So when I said sympathy, here's what I mean by that. I think the fall of man, in our fallen nature, there are two dynamics that take place that are biblical, and they just exist side by side. Number one, we were deceived by an enemy.
Right.
And we have been oppressed, and we continue to be oppressed. There is a war there's a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. But the second is also true. In rebelling against God, we became oppressors.
Right. We
We
participated
oppress
in our own.
others, and we oppress ourselves, and we occupy both roles simultaneously.
Yeah.
So that on one thread, we can look at what we do, and we can say it's wrong because we're doing it, we're oppressors. On another thread, the same person, the same context, they are being oppressed.
Yeah.
And so I think when I was young, I only saw the oppressor, and people have to repent of their sins. And, and that's the only thing I did. And then as time goes on, I began to realize, but we're also oppressed. And so I began to have sympathy. And for a season, I only thought about that.
How much of that
And
is
then-
fatherhood? Because as a father, you look with so much unconditional love at your children and realize, oh, how much innocence there really is. Whereas as a kid, do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, I
It's
do.
easier to have sympathy for a kid now than it was as a kid to have sympathy for each other or for others.
Yes, I think it is the maturing process that enables you to see both strands of truth and honor them both, whenever it seems appropriate. And the reason I wanted to mention that is because this conversation makes me think of Obama,
Okay.
something I've said before. Because I think this is Obama too. I think he's completely playing a role. He has fabricated his life,
Yeah.
and he has a worship that comes with it.
But do you see him as Taylor Swift in the sense of like he's on his way somewhere, or that he's perfectly complicit in the manipulation?
I think, no, it's never one strand. It's always
always
both
both.
strands.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Human nature never, no context ever is just one.
Right.
It is always both.
But there is a point.
It doesn't mean you emphasize both in a context. There may be a situation that calls out for a response to one of those strands.
So what I'm saying is there's a point where God hardens Pharaoh's heart. There's
Yes.
a point where it's enough, where God even says, where
Yeah.
Jesus says, enough with you. I'm not reaching out to you anymore. And that's when he enters into these dialogues, calling them a pit of snakes, or whitewashed tombs.
Yeah.
It's saying that to the humble, there's grace, but to the proud, I will oppose you.
Okay, so what I'm hearing you say by that is in a sense, the strand of being oppressed elicits compassion and offer for help. But even God at some point withdraws that and says, and he hardens Pharaoh's heart, whatever scriptures you want to use, there are enough examples.
Yeah.
And it seems as if he only then is responding to the you're an oppressor strand.
Well, and I wouldn't put it that way exactly, for the reason that there are people who are genuinely oppressed, but the narrative of I'm oppressed, it's not my fault, is its own form of pride.
Well, that's never right.
Right.
That's only one strand, as if the other doesn't exist.
But I mean,
It's always both.
it's always both. But what I'm saying is, being oppressed, I don't think that's what earns you God's grace. It's being humble about your role in the corruption of your own life. Does that make sense? Someone can be oppressed and yet supremely arrogant, angry at God and the world, blaming everyone for everything gone wrong, maybe accurately, but there's always some place that they need to humble themselves and realize that they're not right.
What I'm hearing you say is that if they only respond to the oppressed things in their life and don't see themselves as oppressor anywhere, then while God is moved with compassion for them, he's after them repenting. They have to acknowledge something they've done somewhere.
Well, and I don't think you can categorize all sin as oppressing someone. That's what I'm saying. So even if you've never oppressed anyone, you can still be arrogant. You can still be greedy. You can still be lustful, right? There's a lot of sin that people say, oh, it doesn't harm anyone.
Yeah.
But it's still sin.
Yeah.
Because it's an affront to God.
Yeah, I think you could argue that it is.
Yeah.
Because anytime you don't love your neighbor as yourself, you are oppressing them.
Yeah.
You're doing harm to them.
By not being who you could be.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
And not giving them the dignity, in whatever way that there is required of you towards them.
Okay, we're talking about pop culture. We have to be careful that we don't become grumpy old men who just think all the new things are terrible.
Okay.
I found myself doing that recently.
We're skipping
every
must,
movie.
right?
Well, I have something to add to pop
okay.
culture. Every movie that comes out, I just roll my eyes now. You know, I'm grumpy at Disney for all the woke nonsense.
Yeah.
Every all the Star Wars movies are ruined and blah blah
You
blah.
think you're
And I just
becoming
this old guy. So
grumpy old man.
So the new Hunger Games. There's a new Hunger Games movie that's a prequel, and I had the same response. Like, roll my eyes.
You watched it?
Nope.
I haven't seen it
But
yet.
I had that response to the trailer. Like, here's another one.
Okay.
And the big thing that I held against it in the trailer is like, oh, they're taking the villain and making him sympathetic, and it's not really his fault, and blah blah blah.
But that's the conversation we were
Which
just
is
having.
the trailer, right? So I listened to a couple different people who would agree with us on the perspective of society. Say, no, it's actually really good.
I've heard it's good too.
So I'm gonna go see it.
I'm
I'm
interested
gonna
in
report
seeing
back
it. Yeah.
to see if
I am
it's actually any
interested.
good. I'm
But-
not a huge Hunger Games guy.
Yeah.
So I may not
Yeah,
enjoy
yeah.
it that much, but
But this would be along the same lines of the acknowledgement. Hitler.
okay.
For practical purposes, we get to use him as the personification of the highest, high achieving human evil, oppressor status. There was a time when he was a little boy had a mom and dad.
Sure.
He had a time of
Just a fledgling art
undeveloped
student.
innocence that is childish. Sin is, I think everyone is born with it, but that doesn't mean it's grown up in what it could be or could not be. It grows up in everybody, so we use the word innocence as long as it's air quoted, because nobody's innocent from one perspective, but from another, everybody is born. It's not become, sin is not grown up yet. And so there's an innocence that is in children until it starts to grow up, and then they're going to enter the battle too.
Right.
But until that happens, it's there and it shows itself, but it's not yet grown into an ugly, thorny thistle. So
And
to
my
speak.
sense of it, if I try to imagine the story of Hitler growing up,
Yeah.
what I always fall to is who harmed him in such a way that he resented, and that resentment grew into a desire to destroy.
Something like that. That's
But
right.
but it's not just Hitler, right?
Yeah.
And I remember
But
you mentioned
you're
that
right.
Hitler was like an artist,
Yeah,
and he wanted
yeah,
beautiful
yeah,
things.
That's right.
And was Stalin that way? Was Mao that way? Well,
Yes.
the cultural evolution and the history of China, like I think there's definitely that
Yeah.
same impulse. We're gonna create a new culture from the ashes, but first we have to burn the old one down.
Yeah.
So there's an arrogance to that, the assumption that you can even do that.
I know. I agree.
On your own. But the real arrogance is not that whether you can build a culture, because this is a culture building enterprise, as I say every episode, but can you build it in your own image? Can you redefine good and
Yeah.
evil?
They reject God to become all that they could and were meant to be.
Yeah.
I don't want to do it with you though.
Yeah.
And that's blameworthy. That's not right.
Well, hey, let's jump in for a VP for Trump. What do you want to say about that?
Oh, I don't know if you saw the article. Somebody went through the list and said, here's no for this, no for Ben Carson
Ben Carson.
is what they said.
Who is this? Who's saying this?
I didn't write it down.
All right, I'm going to look. American
you can look
Greatness.
Yeah, Thaddeus, the guy Thaddeus.
Eric Lindrum.
Oh, Lindrum.
Okay, so here's my first impulse, and I actually heard someone bring this up this week, and I agreed. He's so sleepy.
I understand.
He's slow paced. What does he actually bring?
Oh, he brings a lot of things for Trump, right?
I'm talking about the campaign. What does he bring to the campaign?
Oh, okay. That's, I think, the biggest mark against
keep him in the cabinet. That's
is
fine.
Having somebody, Kennedy adds Johnson to get Texas. You add somebody with the state electoral votes, right? That's the great strategy. And that is the great defect of this idea.
Yeah.
Minus that, because I don't think Ben Carson brings any electoral votes. But maybe Trump says, I don't really need him to do that. I don't know.
Right.
But what he does is he is a better than Mike Pence. He has been a loyal individual, highly valuable to Trump. He has remained, what's interesting is he's remained respected by the left. And it's curious as to why. He really hasn't been attacked. He
does have a nice
guy.
rags to riches inner city single mom story that appeals to liberals.
He's black. That is a part of it. Mm-hmm. But he's also, yes, the rags to riches story. He's kind without fail.
I think in a traditional presidential campaign, just growing up listening to campaigns, you want to pick a VP that's from a different region of the U.S.
I agree.
And then you want a demeanor that's more aggressive. So I'll often hear that the role of the VP in the campaign is to be the bulldog, right? And Biden did that, where he could get way aggressive, and then Obama could be stately and intelligent. He did a little bit. He did a little bit.
So.
But Trump is his own bulldog, so he broke that system for
that's
sure.
True.
But that is what I see Vivek trying to lay himself out, because he was super aggressive in that GOP debate last night. Because he's saying to Trump, I'll be your bulldog.
Okay. I agree with that. I have an additional thought, and that is I suspect that he already talked to Trump before he ran, and he offered Trump. He has almost done nothing but defend Trump.
Right.
And almost as if he has said, I'll be a surrogate in your place if you're willing.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna require that you make me your VP, probably, but I'd like to be considered in this whole process, however it shakes out.
Well, his goal is he's not stealing votes from Trump.
That's right.
He's trying to steal votes from
That's what I
the
totally
other three.
think. And I believe from day one he thought, I have no chance to win. I'm not even trying to win.
Yeah.
I'm going to try to be vociferous and take down, and I'm going to say the words that say if I was a president.
You know what I'm seeing, though? I'm seeing him, he mentioned last night and spoke highly of Ron DeSantis.
Now that's interesting.
Just that he said he's a good guy in passing. And it was as he was attacking Nikki Haley and openly saying you're corrupt because she's made all these millions after getting out of federal government work.
Yeah.
Mocking Chris Christie, telling him to go get himself a good meal and drop out of the race.
He shouldn't even have been on the stage.
And so what I see Vivek doing is also lining himself up next to DeSantis. In fact, I listened to a testimonial at a big event in Iowa a few weeks ago, where at the breaks, it's Nikki Haley and Chris Christie talking.
Yeah.
And it's Ron DeSantis and Vivek chatting each other up.
Yeah.
And it's
now,
like, we're taking sides.
Why?
Well,
why do you think?
Ideologically, they both are coming out in the same.
That's true.
Let's break down this
they
big
share
state.
More in common.
Let's make real big changes to how the federal government works.
I think there's something else, but you won't like it. I think he doesn't think. I think he thinks DeSantis is in third place. It's really Haley as the only option. Haley is garnering all the anti-Trump vote. She's and
pulling those donors.
And so those donors and those voters are not available to DeSantis.
Yeah.
DeSantis is competing directly with Trump for the same people, and I think this is what I think, that he's already lost that. And my guess would be Vivek thinks he's already lost it. So I'm going to stand next to him and attack the only one that's worth attacking, because my standing next to you is not really going to help you anymore.
You know, it's interesting. Talking to Dace, or listening to Dace the other day.
That was funny. Talking to Dace.
Well, he has mentioned me on his podcast because I put stuff into some of the back and forth questions and answers. But he was talking about polls. And in ever since the 2020 election, even 2016, Democrats have outperformed their polls by everywhere from 5 to 15%.
Yeah.
And he's showing that because Republicans in the last the midterms said, "Oh, it's going to be a red wave," and it was nothing. It fizzled into nothing.
Yeah.
So even the polls are a form of manipulation.
Yeah.
And so what is happening, and it's becoming this pattern where Republicans get all big on their polls, we're winning, then they lose, and then it starts again. Well, we'll say whatever it takes to get the polls ahead, but never do the thing it takes to win.
Yeah. So that was in the last 2 episodes, or
It might have been.
anyway, because I heard him talking about that same thing, and I agreed with his assessment and observation, but I thought he undersold. He did not even bring up the potential of corruption in voting as a part of this. So
Right.
he's assuming that the polls are wrong and they're manipulative. And I assume that they're manipulation tools. But I also think they're manipulated for Democrats to get out their votes and make it think like they're going to win.
Yeah.
And I don't believe the polls ever anymore. But what I look at the polling, like the 2022, for example, and whatnot, the red wave that didn't, well, Carrie Lake would have been a part of the red wave. The other senator in Arizona would have been part of the red wave. The one that was in Colorado.
Yeah.
I think they were flat out stolen.
Right.
I
And which
think
is
the
the
red
reason
wave
Ron
was-
DeSantis can win by 20
That's
is
right.
because he cleaned up the election
That's
process.
right. And I think
And he
that-
actually gave a plan last night of what he would actually do to deal with it. Because he and Vivek both openly said it was stolen. And the other two were
good.
like, no, it's a misunderstanding.
But see, I don't know why Dace didn't. See, I think he's coming
talked
to a
about it before, but
solution.
it's just not what he was focused on.
Yeah.
His
I
obsession
figured.
with polls recently has been because the Trump supporters who go against him, because he's endorsed DeSantis now, all they talk about is how ahead Trump is in these polls. And so that's just the thing he's been
Yeah, that's
hammering.
fair enough too.
Yeah.
I think polls, but I did get a sense that because he kept saying, "You Trump supporters are idolaters,"
Yeah.
and I thought this is gaslighting. It's not that it couldn't be true, but that's not a reasonable assessment of the whole.
Well, and I think there is a weird obsessive worship of Trump among some people.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
What I also see, though, is there are a lot of like influencer types who play all the dirty tricks. It's sort of the interesting conversation we're having about church leaders in politics, where the people on Trump's side are willing to do all kinds of dirty tricks, openly lying about positions people have taken, accusing people of things that haven't happened, just faking things, right? This is sort of Trump's group. And they're mostly online influencers who don't really have a big say in anything that happens in real elections. But in the Twitter world, where all of these thought leaders are battling it out, it pulls the conversation away. And so to that end, I think if you're willing to compromise your ethics to get your guy, there is an idolatry to that. There is and that can, anybody's susceptible to that.
Or
But I
in
do
the
think
new media
Dace loves
world,
that.
They have a media wing of the campaign, and they give each of these wings a little bit of autonomy to go get it done, because you can't have a single individual over every single aspect, and the media wing is playing a little dirty. And that doesn't
for sure.
necessarily mean that you agree with it or would do it. Maybe you could even be glad they're doing it, but I don't want to promote it, right? But it doesn't necessarily mean that they are. It may be they think this is the way you have to play media, because media is all
For
lying.
sure. But there's a question of how dirty are you willing to be?
Yeah,
for your
I
candidate.
hear you on
And that's but the other side of that, and this is a whole can of worms I don't want to get into today, is that the accusation of idolatry is so overused about everything.
I know, but
And
my
it gets
fear is
to
that
be
you
worn out.
poo-poo idolatry as an idea, and I think it's a huge biblical idea.
I think it's huge.
Yeah.
Huge. I think it's like crying wolf. If you call everything idolatry, it means nothing.
Yeah.
So I think it needs to be better defined and described.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, what you're really just saying is you're not holding the right priorities, or it just becomes a label to every sin.
One of the things I enjoyed about in listening to the Dace episode is he made me think, because he was heavy for DeSantis, which I don't mind at all in a primary setting.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Be heavy for whoever you want. And he's clear, I'm going to vote for the nominee, but my right is to choose right now who I want.
Yeah.
That's what primaries are about.
Right.
But it made me think about, because I once occupied the same spot about DeSantis, an enthusiasm for it. And I'm asking myself, so what did really change? And it was, and then I did not watch the thing with him and Newsom. I've read several articles about it, and one of the best ones I read said, it depends on where you start from and how you view that debate. If you're sold on DeSantis, you think you kick butt all over the place.
Right.
But if you're a quasi, I don't know, you might think it's a tie. That Newsom, maybe he got a few laughs against him, but he went to the enemy's territory and he left out, still in one piece.
I encourage you to watch it. I mean,
Yeah.
I didn't watch the whole thing, but I saw enough
Yeah.
to have a strong opinion.
Yeah.
But it'd be interesting to talk
What
about
was
that
your strong
sometime.
opinion?
Oh, that Newsom didn't have a leg to stand on. He was just
Yeah.
getting run circles
I mean,
around.
Day says Newsom, his political career was destroyed, and
Yeah.
he'll never be president now.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Now, what are you going to do with that? Because you just made the prediction earlier that he's going to be the next president.
I just heard that and I thought, wow, maybe. I mean, that would be
From
good.
his-
I would totally be
Here's
wrong.
where Dace, and
I think he's an evil man.
Here's where Dace goes wrong at times, is that he has a ton of experience in early election politics, being in Iowa, right? His whole career growing up, he grew up in Michigan, but working in Iowa and
Yeah.
seeing the campaigns.
Yeah, yeah.
And so campaigns don't work the way they used to. And so
I agree.
20 years ago, if that kind of performance, he would have been a laughingstock and nobody would have taken him seriously. But it doesn't matter now because his site's never going to see that performance.
Yeah,
They're not going to watch Hannity.
yeah.
So he can go on there and has almost nothing to lose. The people who
That's what I
represent him
tend to
are going to
think,
portray
too.
him as the winner no matter what happens. And nobody's going to go check.
Yeah.
And so people on our side will think we're ahead and then they'll make the polls reflect it. But when it really comes down to the vote, it had no impact. And
That's
that is the
totally
trick
what
that
I
we're
think
stuck
too.
in.
So
But
DeSantis can have, he was governor of San Francisco.
yeah,
It is the epitome of the most failed political structure in the history of the United States, probably. Maybe compared to Chicago in its heyday of utter corruption by mob rule.
yeah. Okay,
But he won't pay that price.
we got to go. We're at an hour and a half.
Hour
All
and a half.
Hey, you've been listening to On Second Thought with Mike and Luke. If you enjoy this episode or found something to reconsider, share it with a friend, start a good conversation, and remember, dig a little deeper and think again. We'll see you next time.